Welcome back, guys. I'm really excited today to show you how to use this to lift this. This is going to be an important video and a special video. We are going to lift my Force Gurkha BS6 using the Blue Garage lift kit. Please do watch this video patiently because we are going to discuss everything about lifting. How to lift, why lift, and how does the lift work, what are the mechanics of it, and what are the results after lifting. And mainly, we'll see how to install this lift kit correctly. And finally, what are the pros and cons of lifting a truck. Watch this video patiently without skipping or rushing to see actually what's going on under there. Once you're done with this video, I assure you that you'll be much better off to make an informed decision. So come along and don't skip. Let's go. The first question is, why do you lift your truck? There are two ways to lift. The first is the body lift, where the body is lifted off and above the frame. The second is the suspension lift, where you lengthen, modify, or change your suspension to effectively push the wheels down and as a result lift the body. Let's get to the pros and cons. The obvious advantage is increasing ground clearance. The body goes up, taking everything up with it and leaving better clearance under it. Another advantage, which is quite popular, is that lifting lets you fit bigger tires. This makes the ground clearance go up even further, and if done right, you get a killer looking car. The approach, departure and the ramp over angles, which are very important for off-roading, get definitely better when the truck is lifted up. Water weighting is also going to improve because the intakes sit higher. We do have to watch out for the cons. Even though very minor, the sight lines of the driver changes with respect to the bonnet line. Even the headlight throw would be different because they are at a different height now. These can of course be tackled, but we need to know and understand what's going on. If we choose to go for bigger tires, we should consider the additional weight. Because if the same suspension is going to work, it is going to have to work harder. The drivetrain is going to have to roll a bigger tire down, and the center of gravity is going to move up in an already top heavy truck. Off-road, the heavier tires are going to put bigger shock loads on the drivetrain. So we have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages and find a sweet spot between the two. So before playing around with the suspension, let's see how the suspension is set up on the Force Gurkha BS6. Let's x-ray the vehicle. The front end, we have the double wishbone independent front suspension setup, and on the rear we have a multi-link coil suspension with panhard rod. So we can see that the rear differential is sitting on the beam axle between the two wheels, whereas the front has the diff attached to the body and there's no beam. Short drive shafts distribute the torque from the differential to each front wheel independently, and hence this is called IFS. If you want to know how the torque from the engine goes to all the four wheels in a 4x4 like the Gurkha, I highly recommend you to click on this card and watch my 4-wheel drive video after you're done here. Okay, what about the Mahindra Thar, the main competition to the Gurkha? Surprise, surprise, the Thar also has IFS in the front and multi-link rail suspension, but you'll hear more Gurkha owners complaining about the GC because of the peculiar design of the lower wishbone in the front. And not to mention the greatest mystery of the 21st century, which is the Gurkha's tax plate. I'll link the video here on how I tackled the tax plate problem. Please watch it later to understand what all the hue and cry is about. Okay, what about the old Gurkha Extreme? How was its suspension setup? Well, the Extreme had a front suspension which had a rigid live axle, which means it also had a beam on which the diff was sitting and both the wheels were connected, unlike the BS6 Gurkha, which has an independent front suspension. The difference between these two is very important to understand if you're planning to lift your truck. While the IFS is a more evolved form of suspension and is great for ride quality and on-road manners, the old rigid axle allowed greater wheel travel. Because the longer rod connecting the wheels could obviously make a bigger angle, as you can see in the video. This made it great for lifting. And if you remember, the Extreme in fact came with a 3-inch factory lift. In contrast, the IFS of the BS6 Gurkha has shorter drive shafts connecting to the diff, and each wheel is independent. So the travel of each wheel is lesser, as you can see the angles on the screen. We should remember this to understand what happens while lifting an IFS vehicle. Let's get onto the vehicle now and actually see the suspension. Here's the lower control arm. The steering rod. This is the drive shaft connecting to the wheel assembly. This is the outer CV joint. I'll talk about it later. The steering rod running to the rack and pinion. Let's duck under this and you can see the short drive shaft, which is the CV axle. It has a CV boot on either end, outer connecting to the wheel and inner connecting to the diff. Notice that the CV axle is almost parallel to the ground, flat, and let's say 0 degrees. When the wheel articulates, the up travel is called the bump and the down travel is called the droop. These rubber knobs take that play and act as bump stop and droop stop at either extreme of the limit of travel. Coming to the suspension as such, we have the coils. They are coiled around the strut or the shock absorber. The coil takes the weight of everything above it, which is the sprung weight, and the shock absorber acts as a damper. This is where we are going to put the spacer. To understand how the spacer is going to work on the lift kit, we need to understand the suspension. So this is the coil and the strut is inside it. You can see the upper control arm and this is the lower control arm. This part is what is peculiarly designed in the Gurkha, and here the wheel is here, the hub of the wheel. So this is the strut. We are going to put a spacer on top of the strut, which is going to elongate the strut effectively and push the wheel down. So what will happen to the lower control arm? Obviously, it will make an angle and go up towards the center of the vehicle. Here you can see the strut and coil working and the steering rod turning the wheel and the wheel traveling up and down. Let's see what is in the box of the Blue Garage lift kit. We have 2 strut spacers which will go on top of the front struts. We have 2 coil spacers which will go at the bottom of the rear coils, and we have 2 upper control arm spacers which are going to go on top of the upper control arm, and we have all the nuts and bolts which are required for the installation. Now let's see how this lift kit actually works. So we have the strut and the coil around it. So when spacer is inserted, it pushes the strut down and the wheel is pushed down at the ball joint and the body lifts up. But since we push the wheel down at the lower end, its axis is tilted. So we adjust the caster by inserting spacers on the upper control arms. But note that this lifts only the front end of the body up. So to level it, we also insert spacers below the coils at the rear end. It is important to level the vehicle because remember, there are other shafts and joints running from front to the back, and we need to keep those working angles in mind and within limits. Now all that's fine, but many may wonder, how does this lifting actually solve the lower control arm and ground clearance issue of the Gurkha? Because it seems that only the body is being lifted and the wheel and its arms remain as it is. So let us see what happens at the wheel. Initially, the lower control arms were flat and they were making almost a parallel angle to the ground. But so the GC was only this much. But once the strut was pushed down by the spacer, this joint went down along with the wheel, and so the lower control arm actually went up at an angle, and so that increases the clearance. So the control arm is actually at a different angle than the original, and that contributes to the additional ground clearance. Wait, this is only the control arms. What about the CV joint? As we saw some time before, the job of this CV axle is to transfer the torque from the diff to the wheel. It does this through the CV joints. These are metal on metal joints which are called CV or constant velocity, because regardless of the angle at which one shaft is rotating, it makes the other shaft also rotate at the same constant velocity. So if the wheel goes up, down or turns side to side, it doesn't matter. The CV will pass on the drive at the same rotational speed. But it is pretty complex and a finicky joint. Let's see how the inside of the joint looks like. So there is one shaft here and the other shaft here. This is the CV boot, which is the rubber black thing you see. So this is the cage and a cup. So if you take it off, you will actually see how complex this joint is. It needs to be this complex to do its work properly, and it can operate through a range of angles safely, but it is always good to have it as close to zero as possible. Well, that does look complex. So does it break often? Well, if not the entire axle, the boot is the most common culprit. As you can see here, some spirited off-road driving has cut and busted my boot on something. If not changed promptly, this will snowball into a bigger problem, because some kind of trash is going to enter into that complex assembly through this. But the biggest enemy to the CV joint as such is shock loading. The joint is weakest when it is operating at extreme angles, say at a full turn or a full bump or droop. And at that time, if a heavy weight like an upsized tire falls into a dip or a ditch, that's going to put a lot of strain on the joint. That's exactly why we need to be careful with how heavy the wheels are going to be. And we want to keep the joint as parallel as possible so it can play around with its full spectrum of angle. Not to worry, we will live to fight another day. So here's the spare, and we will fit it when the wheels come off for the lift kit. Thanks for your patience. Now we will actually see how to install the Blue Garage lift kit correctly. I have shown the full process in 15 steps which are easy to follow. We loosen the wheel nuts first. Jack up the truck on a lift. All the wheels come off next. As a safety, disconnect all the anti-roll bars, and if possible even disconnect the CV axle itself. The Blue Garage video tells us to disconnect the clip of the boot only, but I found it better if you can disconnect the complete axle and put it back after the spacer is in position. This helps you not to strain the CV axle when you are playing around with the spacer. The upper control arm bolts and the strut bolts, these are what are to be taken off. So remove the locking pins first and remove the upper arm bolts. The strut bolts go off next. With that, we can pull out the strut assembly. And now you can bolt the spacer on top of the strut as shown. The strut along with the spacer can now be fit back into position. The upper control arm spacers bolt on right here. Once you've done that, you can put back everything you just removed. We can see the spacer in position. Moving on to the rear wheels now. Disconnect the anti-sway bars. For safety, whichever line is taut or stretched, disconnect it and remember to connect it back later. The rear shocks come off next. Depending on what state of load your vehicle is in now, the coil can be a little tricky to pull out. We had to externally compress the spring to take it out. Insert the real coil spacer at the bottom. It is stepped, so it won't be difficult to find the correct position. Put back the rubber on the top of the coil. Make sure that you're putting the spring the right way up. These are progressive springs, which means the pitch changes through the length of the spring. And the spacer has a step, so it snugly fits. There's no problem with that. After that, install the coil back in place. And so the coils are in position. At this point, check if the rear shock is already at its full limit. For me, it was already at its full extension, so it was quite a task to bolt it back on. I wish Blue Garage had given us a small joining piece or a spacer for the shock also to retain its range of play, but it became alright after I put the vehicle down. All spacers are in place. Bolt on back all the wheels and put everything back together. Make sure you connect everything back, whichever you disconnected. The moment of truth. Gently drop the truck back to ground. And now it's time for the big reveal, the before and after results. And here is the lifted Force Gurkha BS6. To measure the changes, we need a baseline. And what better baseline than a bone stock Force Gurkha in showroom condition at the showroom. The GC at the lower bash plate is a silly 135 mm and the front fender sits at 845 mm, that is about 33.3 inches. The rear fender is at 880 mm, that is 34.6 inches, and the rear diff is at 210 mm. The showroom Gurkha runs 245/70/16 all-terrain tires, whereas I run 245/75/16 mud-terrain tires, which already gives me about an inch of lift. With the Blue Garage lift kit installed, you can see the before and after profile picture of my Gurkha. View from below when the vehicle was parked on the ramp at the exact same spot before and after. Front view shows off the ground clearance and the lift at the lower control arms. The front fender line now has been lifted to 37 inches, which is a clean 3-inch lift over my previous 34 inches. The rear fender line stock was 34.6, and interestingly, the Blue Garage lift kit puts at 36.6 inches, which means that the front lift and the back lift are not equal. The stock Gurkha had a rake with the back slightly up and the nose dipping down, which the Blue Garage lift kit has leveled it out. Just like leveling kits used on cargo carrying pickup trucks, which also have a rake, the difference in the bonnet lines on the picture above clearly shows the difference, with the top one sloping downwards towards the front and the lifted bonnet being more horizontal. How does the lift kit affect basement parking and garage clearances? Let's find out. On lifting, the roof line is at 2050 mm, that is 80.7 inches from the ground. If you have the official carrier installed, that is at 2265 mm, 89.2 inches on the left side of the vehicle. The topmost point is the jerrycan line on the right side of the vehicle, which is at 2360 mm or 93 inches from the ground. Let me take you through the story of evolution of my Gurkha. Right at the top, you can see the stock Gurkha with my first mod, which is the Maxxis Mud Terrain 245/75/16 tires. These did help a bit in increasing a little bit of clearance and raising the control arms a little bit higher. The second picture is where I did something about the tax plate, where I removed the tax plate and modified it. And that gave me about 235 mm clearance at the center of the vehicle. The lower arms remained the same. Then I went with the Pratt bash plate, trading a little bit of ground clearance for extreme protection. And now the Blue Garage lift kit is my fourth model. Before, the Pratt plate gave me a 200 mm clearance, and now with the lift kit I have a comfortable 275 mm even below the bash plate. This is despite the gap I have left between the diff and the plate. This I can adjust a little bit higher if needed using the bolt setting on the left, but I have left it here. The lower arms are at 245 mm now, and the rear diff sits 240 mm above the ground. The difference in the lift achieved at the front and the rear diffs is again because of the IFS, because when the body went up, the front diff went up with it. However, the rear diff is sitting on the axle and didn't rise up with the body. And because the diff at the front went up with the body and the wheels went down, the lower arm lifted, but the CV axle also is operating at a slight angle, which should concern us if it is too steep. But here I can see that it is okay and it is still settling down. I measured the angle crudely and it was about 10 to 12 degrees, which I think should be okay. The proper way to do this, the real solution, is to proportionally drop the front diff also down so that this becomes parallel again, which is something I'll explore in the future, and that's why I left the gap above the Pratt bash plate and the diff. Do you notice that the clearance between the rubber stop and the lower arm has increased compared to before? If you have watched the full video carefully, you will know the answer why. Let me know in the comments below why that has happened and what is good or bad about it. Concluding review and some FAQs answered. After the lift kit, the truck rides taller, but the ride's definitely not harsh. The handling is not affected much more than how it was before. A small observation beyond the obvious climbing up onto the truck is a little bit more of an exercise, but the sight lines of the driver have definitely changed. You sit taller so you can see farther marginally, but the bonnet line and the higher line of sight puts a small blind spot just ahead of the vehicle. It's a small thing, but it's noticeable. The diff drop, if I can figure out something, is definitely on the cards for my Gurkha. With the present tire setup, I am at a sweet spot for my personal usage and therefore will not be upsizing the tire anytime soon. If you're getting the lift kit installed, make sure you get the alignment done once the truck is lifted and settled. Overall, I'm fine with how the lift kit has worked out and I'm happy with it. The present ride height makes the truck glide over the terrain compared to the previous version where it was crushing the terrain. That's my one-line review. Hope you found the video useful. If you want to know anything else, please leave a comment below and I'll try to answer. If you think this video will be helpful to somebody else, please do share it with them. Don't forget to subscribe because I will be putting feedback on how the lift kit continues to perform. Take care and see you soon. Bye guys.